Good evening. Welcome to The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Here's what's coming up within the half hour. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy takes a speech at the UN General Assembly saying only strong alliances, strong partners and their weapons can stop the war in Ukraine. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa warns on trade being used as a weapon against a number of countries. Plus, Typhoon Ragasa makes landfall in China, having killed at least 17 people in Taiwan. The UN General Assembly is in full swing in New York today. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy gave his address calling for countries of the world to come together as peace depends, in his words, on all of us. He did take a swipe, though, at NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, describing it as a weak institution.
Last year at this assembly, I warned the world about the risk of radiation disasters, especially due to Russia's occupations of our Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the biggest in Europe, but nothing's changed. Nothing's. And yesterday, the plant went into blackout again, and Russia hasn't stopped shelling even in areas near a nuclear facility. And because of international institutions are too weak, this madness continues. Even being part of a long-standing military alliance doesn't automatically mean you are safe. Just recently, 19 simple Russian drones violated Polish airspace, and only 4 were shut down. Luckily, they were not shaheeds or even worse. Otherwise, the results would have been horrific. Estonia had to call a UN Security Council meeting for the first time in history because Russian fighter jets deliberately entered its airspace.
President Zelensky's address presented before an almost emptying hall at the General Assembly issued a warning that the Russian President Vladimir Putin's war will not stop at Ukraine. He emphasizes there are no security guarantees in the war with Russia. He says that while UN members want safety and peace, if a nation wants peace, it still has to work on weapons, and that weapons decide who survives. I do apologize for the mix-up there. Well, as for the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries. He was addressing the General Assembly on Tuesday. President Ramaphosa stressed the need to reform the multilateral trading system, noting that the World Trade Organization remains the only body capable of managing differences and coordinating position in global trade.
The multilateral trading system needs to be reformed as we reconfirm that the World Trade Organization remains the only multilateral body that is capable of managing differences and coordinating positions in global trade. Trade is one of the most important instruments to mobilize domestic resources for development. It is concerning that geopolitical shocks and unprecedented trade policy volatility are destabilizing the global economy and jeopardizing a critical source of development finance. In fact, trade is now being used as a weapon against a number of countries in the world. We must redouble our efforts to strengthen the link between trade and development. Unilateral trade practices and economic cohesion have a detrimental impact on many nations. This includes the economic embargo against Cuba, which has caused untold damage to the country's economy over the years. This unfair embargo must be lifted, and we want it lifted sooner rather than later. In the midst of global trade uncertainty, the African continent is providing a pragmatic example of constructive collaboration and cooperation by using the African Continental Free Trade Area as an engine for sustainable growth and development. This will, with commitment, become the central pillar of economic cooperation and integration for our continent. As part of the effort to build more inclusive economies,
the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, or the ongoing 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, will also have Nigeria's Vice President Kashim Shettima in attendance. His address is scheduled to take place between 3 and 6 p.m. today in New York, with multilateralism, UN reform, climate action, international finance restructure, amongst others, top on the agenda. The Vice President joined other world leaders for the opening session, where President Donald Trump delivered a keynote address, formally welcoming delegates. Our State House correspondent Larry Lasese reports on these and other activities.
Our institution is a waste of money. Outdated.
It's the opening session of the 80th United Nations General Assembly, with world leaders gathered together once again to consider the state of world affairs and put forward their solutions to the challenges confronting countries.
2 world wars in a generation.
Though scheduled to speak on the second day, Vice President Kashim Shettima joined other world leaders for the session.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, people out there in the world watching us. Clearly, we have to do better. But what we should not let cynics allow to weaponize these failures.
Afterwards, the Vice President met with the President of Namibia, Nandi Ndaitwah, on the sidelines. Both leaders committed to deeper bilateral ties, with the Namibian leader praising Nigerian diplomats for their invaluable contributions to her government and country. In a separate high-level session, Vice President Shettima met with a delegation from the Gates Foundation, led by its CEO, Mark Sussman. He thanked the foundation for its support in healthcare, agriculture, and financial inclusion, while calling for expanded investment in Nigeria.
We have no option than to grow. And now our foreign reserves has hit $42 billion. It's still little for a nation of Nigerians. But it's still better than what we made it. I can assure you that President Tinubu, you have a partner that you can trust.
The Minister of Education also appealed for greater support in education.
The initial focus over the years had been on child and other part nutrition, but not in education. But now, I think there's more focus now in education. So we're seeking for more support in that area in the country, so to support our foundational education level.
Engagements also continued into the night as members of the Nigerian delegation considered the successes of attracting investment to the country.
Government is being run like an enterprise this time around. It's giving opportunities to subnationals to come out, discuss who investors back to Nigeria. We've seen a lot of those initiatives in my state, most especially. I've been able to attract investment in agriculture.
And what we're doing is celebrating those investments and wanting to encourage other investors to come in and invest in Nigeria. The federal government has made policy changes that's opening up the space, that's making it more attractive for businesses to come in. So what we want to do is showcase what we are doing and that of our partners as well, and encourage other investors to come invest in Nigeria and come invest in Africa.
I mean, the other governors are here. They are looking at areas where they have competitive and comparative advantage over others. So they can now come together as a team and as a group. And that's what the Governors Forum is all about, and they are part of this forum. So that they can now look at areas where they can let people to come and invest.
The attention of everyone will, however, be on the National Statement of Nigeria, which will be delivered in the second session of Wednesday, as Vice President Shettima is set to address the General Assembly. From New York, Lanre Lasese, Channels Television News.
Let's discuss this further. We're being joined now by former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi. Ambassador Keshi is in Abuja. Thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
It's a pleasure being with you, Amarachi.
It's a pleasure having you on the program. I know you have been observing, the activities at the UN. I want to begin with the Nigerian delegation and the Vice President, who is yet to give his address, set to be between 3 p.m. and 9 p.m. New York time. You heard some of the respondents in that piece by our correspondent, Lanre Lasese, saying that, the call is for investors back in Nigeria. And I see this a lot, sideline meetings, holding at conferences. We're still attracting foreign direct investment. Is it really all important to have that these sorts of meetings on the sidelines of global events such as the United Nations General Assembly?
Oh yes, for sure. It's in a year past, one-time opportunity for governments, leaders, to talk to people from all over the world, gathering in New York for the General Assembly. And so it's a good opportunity if it's well utilized, and if the focus is on getting, investors into Nigeria. My only concern, and from my experience, is that often, I attended this in over almost 6-7 year period. So I have a very good sense of attendance. It's always government to government, relationship. But what we must understand is that notwithstanding, what we must understand is that we are looking for people who will come to Nigeria and invest in critical areas, and not just, any business at all. And so I think that it is very important for the VP and his team that are engaging, investors. My prayers is that they are talking to real investors, not government to government. And I sincerely hope that state governors who are there will also be able to attract investors to their respective region. But one thing I need to say, Amarachi, is that after listening to the president of South Africa, I'm even thinking of waking up, later tonight to listen to the Nigerian vice president, because listening to the broad statements made by the president of South Africa, I think that he's probably taking over to begin to speak not just broadly, but to represent the African view. It's turning out to be the African voice on a number of these issues. I particularly like some of the statements made about trade.
Right, and I was going to highlight that, because I've seen him about 3 or 4 times already, at the UN General Assembly. He's spoken about, the Israel-Gaza, the Israel-Hamas war. He's talked about the recognition of Palestine. He is appearing to be the voice of Africa, and it really makes one wonder what sort of impact Nigeria is making at the UNGA this year.
If I was attending this with colleagues in New York, and I had listened to the president of South Africa, I'll probably have a second look at our statement and see whether we can broaden it rather than remain local and talk about only talk about investors, what's going on in Nigeria and things like that. I've always maintained that, look, people all over the world, particularly governments and investors.
We do seem to have lost audio connection with you, Ambassador.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay, now we can hear you.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that, look, people all over the world, governments in particular, look, they all know the potentials of Nigeria. In fact, they even know more what's going on in Nigeria than most of us in this country. You know, so when you get out there, you're already talking to the converted in one way, but the same converted, they are saying to you, look, we know about your country. Put a few things right, and certainly we begin to look favorably at your country. But in terms of emerging as the African spokesperson, I think the president of South Africa is doing a damn good job, you know, on doing that. You know, I was particularly intrigued at his statement on lifting the sanctions on Cuba. Listen, for so many years, I can't remember who has ever called for sanctions to be lifted on Cuba. And I think this is a very bold statement that, you know, we should welcome, and thank him for reminding everybody that Cuba has been under sanctions from the Americans for well over 50 years.
Right, indeed. Well, 80 years of the United Nations, it is something to celebrate. I mean, we've seen the UN change over the years. In the last few years, it's been plagued with very different peculiar challenges. You have a global pandemic in 2020. Now you have the war in Ukraine, and then you also have the war in Russia. I don't really see African issues being highlighted at the UN, even though the Secretary General Antonio Guterres did mention that in his interview before the start of the UN General Assembly. What exactly are we doing there? What exactly is Africa doing at the UN this year?
You know, Amarachi, I've said this to you many times. I'm not among those who overstate the importance of Africa. For me today, I've always argued, and very strongly too, that Africa is at the periphery of the global discussion. And so quite often, nobody remembers this continent, and which is why tough statements from our leaders, you know, reminding people of so many things, not just about Africa, but the fact that we do exist and that we are part of the global community is very, very important, you know. And I sincerely hope that when our Vice President speaks, he will even be more forthright, drawing attention to some of these, or the dangers that the United Nations itself faces at its 80th anniversary celebration. Because today, the danger that the UN faces is not coming from smaller states like Nigeria or Africa or in other parts of the world. Actually, the United Nations is stressing, you know, by the big powers who no longer want to abide by the rules of international behavior. And I think this is what the rest of the continent, not just of Africa, but the smaller states, and should I use the word they like to use these days, coalition of the willing, must do to ensure that the UN survives, you know, and becomes a stronger organization that can deal with global issues. When you isolate, look, Trump was complaining yesterday that the United States, that the UN was not involved in a number of things. But the fact remains that he, from the beginning, when you look at his first term, he never wanted the United Nations to get involved in everything. Trump just wants to do it alone and take the credit for it. Who on earth have ever, of all the world leaders and everybody who has won the Nobel Prize, has ever gone to the United Nations to argue that, look, for what I have done, I should have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize, except, of course, Donald Trump would do things like that. So for me, there's a lot to be celebrated, but the truth of the matter is that we should worry more about the future. And the future will depend on the behavior of the world powers. The United States, for example, on one hand, and Russia on the other hand. If those two decide to behave and operate within the norms of international behavior and use the platform of the United Nations to seek for peaceful settlement of crisis, I think the United Nations has a long way to go, because in other areas, apart from trying to manage crisis on humanitarian grounds and trying to ensure global economic development, to a large extent, the UN is doing relatively well. But it needs the support of everybody, not just, the superpowers, but not just of the smaller states, but also the superpowers. And the irony of all this, Amarachi, is that the very country that led to the creation of the United Nations is the one today, trying to destabilize the United Nations itself.
Ambassador Joe Keshi, you have said a lot in this interview. We're so happy to have had you on the program. Thank you for your thoughts and your analysis.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And finally, the strongest storm seen in years has made landfall in southern China. Typhoon Ragasa hit the area where 2 million people prepared for its arrival on Tuesday. It comes after authorities said at least 17 people had been killed and more missing in Taiwan after a lake burst on Tuesday, causing severe flooding in the island's east. Ragasa was downgraded from a super to a severe typhoon on Wednesday. It remains highly destructive. Top winds of 241 kilometers per hour recorded in Taishan County in China's southeastern Guangdong province. The equivalent of a Category 5 hurricane, Ragasa is the world's strongest storm this year and has been roaring over the South China Sea for days. Ahead of making landfall, 90 people were injured in Hong Kong as the storm skirted its coastline. The typhoon made landfall on the coast of Hailing Island, Yanjiang City in Guangdong at about 5 p.m. today. It crossed the mainland with sustained winds of 144 kilometers per hour and higher gusts. Wind speeds are expected to gradually weaken as the storm moves westwards over land. The rain will be torrential and slow moving across the region for several more days. That's the world today. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.